On a winter morning in 1993, the gates closed at the Schwinn Bicycle Company factory on the northwest side of Chicago. The machines that had stamped metal and welded frames for nearly a century fell silent. The workers, many of whom had spent their entire careers in that building, walked out for the final time. The company that had once produced more bicycles than any manufacturer in America, that had defined what it meant to own a bike for 3 generations, had declared bankruptcy. The Schwinn name would survive, sold to new owners who would use it to brand bicycles made overseas. But the factory, the expertise, the legacy built by a family obsessed with control and perfection ended that day. The story of Schwinn is not about bicycles. It is about how American manufacturing rose and fell in the 20th century. It is about a family that believed their name guaranteed permanence, that quality and dominance could be sustained forever through sheer will. It is about the workers who built an empire they would never own, and the decisions made in boardrooms that destroyed what generations had created. The Schwinn estate, both the physical mansion and the business empire, stands as evidence of what happens when power concentrates in the hands of people who cannot imagine a world where they are not in control. Before we go deeper into the story of ambition, legacy, and the hidden costs of building an empire, if you find these explorations of forgotten American institutions valuable, consider subscribing to see more. And if this kind of detailed historical investigation speaks to you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. Now let us begin. Ignaz Schwinn was born in Hardheim, Germany, a small town in the Kingdom of Baden. His father was a mechanic who worked with precision tools and instilled in Ignaz an obsession with engineering perfection. At 14, Ignaz was apprenticed to a toolmaker. He learned to work with metal, to understand tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, to recognize that quality was not an aspiration, but a standard that could be achieved through discipline. By his early 20s, he had become a master machinist, skilled enough to find work anywhere in Germany's growing industrial economy. But Germany in the 1880s offered limited opportunities for advancement. The guild system controlled who could open shops and compete. Family connections mattered more than skill. Ignaz recognized that his talent would be wasted waiting for permission to succeed. In 1891, at the age of 31, he immigrated to the United States, arriving with technical expertise and no capital. He settled in Chicago, a city being rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1871, a place where the old European rules about class and lineage did not yet apply with the same force. Chicago in the 1990s was experiencing a bicycle boom. The safety bicycle, with 2 wheels of equal size and a chain drive, had recently been perfected. It was replacing the dangerous high-wheeled bicycle that had limited cycling to young athletic men. The safety bicycle could be ridden by anyone. Women adopted cycling as a form of independence and exercise. Working-class men used bicycles to commute to factories. Middle-class families bought them for recreation. The demand seemed limitless. Dozens of small manufacturers competed to supply bicycles to a market that was doubling every year. Ignaz found work at a bicycle factory, where his German training and precision metalwork made him immediately valuable. He understood that most American bicycle manufacturers were assembling components made by others, focusing on marketing and distribution rather than engineering. The bicycles were adequate but inconsistent. Ignaz saw an opportunity. If he could manufacture bicycles to the standards he had learned in Germany, he could differentiate his product in a crowded market. Quality could be a competitive advantage if buyers could be convinced to pay for it. In 1895, Ignaz partnered with Adolf Arnold, a businessman who had capital but no technical knowledge. They formed Arnold and Schwinn Company. The partnership was structured so that Arnold provided financing and handled business operations, while Ignaz controlled all manufacturing decisions. The division of responsibility was absolute. Arnold could not question how bicycles were made.
Ignas could not be overruled on matters of engineering or production. This structure would define the company for the next century, creating both its success and its eventual destruction. From the beginning, Ignas insisted on vertical integration. Other manufacturers bought frames from one supplier, wheels from another, chains from a third. Ignas built a factory that produced every component. He hired German and Czech machinists who understood precision work. He purchased the best steel available and rejected batches that did not meet his specifications, even when the differences were invisible to customers. He designed jigs and fixtures that ensured every frame was identical within tolerances that exceeded industry standards. The process was more expensive and slower than competitors, but the bicycles that emerged were demonstrably superior in durability and performance. The company grew rapidly. By 1900, Arnold and Schwinn Company was producing tens of thousands of bicycles annually. Ignas bought out Adolf Arnold in 1908, renaming the company the Schwinn Bicycle Company and establishing complete family control. He brought his son, Frank, into the business, training him in the same obsessive attention to quality and vertical integration that had built the company. Frank understood that the Schwinn name meant something specific, a bicycle that would last, that would not break, that justified its higher price through reliability. The brand became synonymous with durability in a market where most bicycles were disposable. The wealth accumulated quickly. By 1910, Ignas Schwinn was a millionaire, an extraordinary achievement for an immigrant who had arrived with nothing 19 years earlier. He purchased land in the suburb of Kenilworth on the north shore of Chicago, an area being developed as a retreat for the city's industrial elite. The lots were large, the covenants restrictive, the intent explicit. Kenilworth would be a place where successful men could build estates separate from the noise and pollution and immigrant crowds that filled Chicago. Ignas commissioned a mansion, a sprawling Tudor revival structure with extensive grounds, designed to communicate permanence and European sophistication. The Schwinn estate was not the largest in Kenilworth, but it was substantial. The house featured dark wood paneling imported from Germany, leaded glass windows, and a library that Ignas filled with technical manuals and engineering texts. The grounds included gardens, a greenhouse, and quarters for the staff required to maintain the property. Ignas did not host elaborate parties or cultivate social connections. He worked. He spent 12 hours a day at the factory, then came home to read about metallurgy and mechanical engineering. The mansion was proof that he had succeeded, but it was not where he directed his energy or attention. The business continued expanding through the 1920s. Schwinn bicycles were sold in every state. The company weathered the bicycle market's contraction after the automobile became affordable, maintaining sales by focusing on children and recreational riders while other manufacturers collapsed. Ignas died in 1948 at the age of 88, still involved in company operations until his final illness. Control passed to Frank, who had spent his entire adult life preparing to run the company exactly as his father had. Frank Schwinn was more autocratic than Ignas. Where his father had been obsessed with engineering quality, Frank was obsessed with control. He believed that Schwinn's success came from the family's unwillingness to compromise or share power. The company remained privately held. Frank refused to take on partners or sell equity. He dismissed suggestions to license the Schwinn name to other manufacturers. He rejected proposals to diversify into motorcycles or other products. Schwinn made bicycles, period, and the family alone would decide how they were made and sold. This rigidity created short-term stability but long-term vulnerability. The company was structured around Frank's absolute authority. Managers did not make decisions, they implemented Frank's decisions. Engineers did not innovate independently, they executed designs Frank approved. The culture was hierarchical and inflexible. Employees who questioned the family's judgment were removed. The result was a company that could execute a defined vision with extraordinary consistency, but could not adapt when that vision became obsolete. The estate in Kenilworth increased. Frank expanded the mansion, adding a wing for his growing family and updating the mechanical systems. The property became a symbol of the company's dominance. Visitors to the estate understood they were seeing the physical manifestation of American manufacturing success, a family that had built an empire through immigrant ambition and engineering excellence. The reality was more complicated. The estate was maintained by household staff who were paid modest wages and lived in the servants' quarters. The gardens were tended by workers who commuted from Chicago's less affluent neighborhoods. The luxury existed because the Schwinns extracted sufficient profit from bicycle manufacturing to fund a lifestyle that most of their employees could never approach. The factory on the northwest side of Chicago employed thousands of
Workers at its peak. The jobs were steady and paid better than many manufacturing positions, but they were not generous. Workers assembled bicycles on production lines, performing repetitive tasks for 8 or 10 hours a day. The work was loud, dirty, and physically demanding. The machinery was dangerous. Fingers were crushed in stamping presses. Arms were caught in welding equipment. The injuries were common enough that the company maintained a first aid station staffed by a nurse who treated minor wounds and decided which injuries required hospital visits. The workers were not unionized, a source of pride for Frank Schwinn. He believed unions destroyed the relationship between employer and employee, introducing adversarial thinking where loyalty should exist. He paid enough to discourage union organizing and fired anyone suspected of union sympathies. The strategy worked through the 1950s and 1960s when Schwinn's market position allowed the company to maintain higher margins than competitors. Employees accepted the paternalism because the alternative was unemployment in an industry with few other Chicago manufacturers. The 1970s brought changes that Frank Schwinn did not anticipate and could not control. Japanese manufacturers, particularly Panasonic and Bridgestone, began exporting high-quality bicycles to the United States at prices below what Schwinn could match. The Japanese had adopted manufacturing techniques pioneered in the automobile industry, using automation and process efficiency to reduce costs without sacrificing quality. Schwinn's vertical integration, once an advantage, became a liability. The company was locked into expensive domestic production, while competitors manufactured overseas using cheaper labor. Frank's response was to double down on the Schwinn brand. He increased advertising, emphasizing the company's American heritage and superior quality. He refused to consider moving production overseas, believing that Schwinn bicycles made in Taiwan or Japan would be inferior and damage the brand. He believed customers would pay a premium for American-made quality. This assumption was based on decades of market dominance, but it was increasingly detached from reality. Consumers, especially younger buyers, were more price-sensitive and less loyal to established brands. They bought bicycles based on features and cost, not heritage. The company began losing market share. Schwinn had controlled over 25% of the American bicycle market in the 1960s. By the late 1970s, that share had dropped below 15% and was declining. Revenues fell, profits disappeared. The factory that had run multiple shifts was reducing hours. Workers were laid off. The Schwinn family, insulated by wealth accumulated over decades, did not immediately feel the pressure that was destroying the company. The estate in Kenilworth remained staffed and maintained. Frank continued operating the company as he always had, certain that quality and the Schwinn name would eventually prevail. In 1979, workers at the Chicago factory went on strike, demanding wage increases and better safety conditions. It was the first strike in company history, a direct challenge to the paternalistic system that Frank believed had served everyone well. The strike lasted 13 weeks, one of the longest and most bitter labor disputes in Chicago's manufacturing sector at the time. The factory sat idle. Production stopped. Schwinn lost millions in sales during the peak season.
Frank refused to negotiate, viewing the strike as a betrayal that proved unions destroyed loyalty. The strike ended when workers, unable to sustain the loss of income, accepted a contract that offered minimal improvements, but the damage was irreversible. Frank responded to the strike by moving production. He could not move the entire operation overseas quickly, but he could reduce reliance on the Chicago workers who had challenged him. He contracted with manufacturers in Taiwan and Japan to produce some Schwinn models. The move was presented as a temporary measure to meet demand, but it was the beginning of the end for domestic production. The irony was absolute. Frank Schwinn, who had refused to manufacture overseas because he believed it would compromise quality, was now doing exactly that out of spite and financial desperation. The Taiwanese-made Schwinns were not inferior. In many cases, they were better than the Chicago-made bikes, produced using newer equipment and techniques that Schwinn's aging factory could not match. Customers could not tell the difference and didn't care where the bicycles were made, as long as they performed well and cost less. By the mid-1980s, Schwinn was in crisis. The company was losing money every quarter. The factory in Chicago was operating at a fraction of capacity. The brand that had once dominated American cycling was now competing with dozens of manufacturers, many of whom made better bicycles at lower prices. Frank Schwinn, now in his 70s, refused to acknowledge that the company needed fundamental restructuring. He blamed workers, retailers, competitors, but never the family's decisions. He could not imagine that the system that had worked for 90 years was no longer viable. Edward Schwinn, Frank's son, had different ideas. Edward had worked in the company since college, learning the business as his father and grandfather had. But Edward had traveled to Asia, visited the factories that were supplanting American manufacturing, and understood that vertical integration and domestic production were no longer competitive advantages. He argued that Schwinn should close the Chicago factory entirely, move all production overseas, and focus on design, marketing, and distribution. The Schwinn name still had value, but it needed to be attached to competitive products, not expensive nostalgia. Frank rejected Edward's proposals. The arguments between father and son became bitter. Frank viewed Edward's suggestions as a betrayal of everything the family had built. Edward saw his father's stubbornness as destroying the company generations had created. The conflict was not just about business strategy, it was about identity, about what it meant to be a Schwinn, about whether the family's legacy was the company or the name. In 1991, Frank Schwinn was forced to step down. The company's financial condition had deteriorated to the point where creditors were threatening to force bankruptcy. Edward took control, but it was too late. The company owed tens of millions to suppliers and lenders. The factory was worth less than the debt secured against it. The Schwinn name was still valuable, but the company itself was insolvent. Edward tried to restructure, negotiating with creditors and attempting to salvage some version of the business, but the numbers didn't work. On October 8, 1992, the Schwinn Bicycle Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing made national news. Schwinn was not just another failed manufacturer, it was an American institution, a brand that had been synonymous with bicycles for a century. The bankruptcy was presented as evidence of broader trends: the decline of American manufacturing, the rise of global competition, the end of an era in which families could build industrial empires and pass them down through generations. All of that was true, but it was also incomplete. Schwinn failed because the family that controlled the company could not adapt, could not relinquish control, could not imagine the system that had worked in one era would fail in another. The bankruptcy court oversaw the liquidation. The Chicago factory was sold to a developer who converted it to loft apartments. The machinery was auctioned. The Schwinn name and intellectual property were purchased by Questor Partners, an investment firm that licensed the brands to manufacturers in Asia and Taiwan. The Schwinn bicycles sold today have no connection to the company that Ignatz founded or the workers who built bicycles in Chicago for a century. They are designed by anonymous teams, manufactured in factories that produce multiple brands, and marketed as heritage products that evoke a past they did not create. The Schwinn estate in Kenilworth remained in family hands for years after the company's collapse. The mansion was eventually sold in the early 2000s, purchased by a buyer who had no connection to bicycles or manufacturing. The new owners renovated the property, removing some of the original details and updating the house for contemporary luxury living. The estate is now worth millions, valued for its location and size, not for its history. The connection to the Schwinn family is a footnote in real estate listings, a piece of trivia that adds a vague sense of legacy without explaining what that legacy actually represents. The workers who built Schwinn bicycles are scattered. Some retired before the bankruptcy, collecting pensions that were protected in the liquidation. Others lost jobs and had to find work in an economy that had few opportunities for skilled manufacturing workers in their 50s and 60s. The knowledge they possessed, the expertise in frame welding and wheel building and quality control, became obsolete. Bicycles are now designed on computers and manufactured by machines that require different skills. The craft that took years to learn disappeared when the factory closed. What remains is the story, and the story has been simplified. Schwinn is remembered as a great American brand that could not compete with foreign manufacturers. The narrative is about globalization and the decline of domestic manufacturing, which is true but incomplete. Schwinn failed because the family that controlled the company prioritized control over adaptation. They believed their name guaranteed success. They believed quality and heritage would sustain market dominance. They believed customers would remain loyal, even as competitors offered better products at lower prices. Every one of those beliefs was wrong.
The estate in Kenilworth, the mansion built with profits extracted from bicycle manufacturing, was supposed to be permanent. It was designed to communicate that the Schwinn family had arrived, that they were part of the American elite, that their wealth would endure across generations. The house is still there, still valuable, still occupied, but it has been severed from its origin. The current owners do not think about the workers who stamped metal in a Chicago factory. They do not consider the families whose wages paid for the imported wood paneling and leaded glass windows. The mansion is just a house, expensive and well located, with a history that no longer matters to anyone who lives there. The factory site is now luxury condominiums, the industrial space where thousands of workers assembled bicycles for nearly a century has been converted into living spaces for young professionals and wealthy retirees. The transformation is complete. The machinery is gone. The noise and danger and labor have been erased. What remains is exposed brick and high ceilings and the aesthetic of industrial heritage without any of the industrial reality. Residents pay premium prices to live in a building that once represented working-class employment and manufacturing expertise. The irony is visible only to those who remember what the building was before it became what it is now. There are lessons in the Schwinn story, though they are uncomfortable and rarely stated plainly. The first lesson is that control and quality are not sufficient for long-term success. Schwinn made excellent bicycles, but excellence did not protect the company when market conditions changed. The family's insistence on maintaining control prevented them from adapting. They could have sold equity and brought in outside management with experience in global manufacturing. They could have licensed the brand and focused on design rather than production. They could have recognized earlier that vertical integration was becoming a liability. They did none of these things because control mattered more than survival. The second lesson is about labor. The Schwinn family accumulated wealth by extracting value from workers who had no ownership or control. The workers built the bicycles that generated profits, but those profits flowed to the family, not to the people who created the products. When the company failed, the family retained the wealth they had accumulated. The mansion, the investments, the assets were protected.
The workers lost their jobs, and their expertise became worthless. The system that created this outcome was not accidental. It was designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of owners, while treating labor as a cost to be minimized. The third lesson is about legacy. The Schwinn family believed they were building something permanent, an institution that would carry their name and values forward for generations. They succeeded in creating something that lasted nearly a century, which is extraordinary by any measure. But the legacy is not what they intended. Schwinn is now a brand owned by a corporation that makes bicycles in Asia, using the Schwinn name to sell products that have nothing to do with the company that Ignaz founded. The workers who built the empire are forgotten, their expertise irrelevant, their labor reduced to a historical footnote. If you've stayed with this exploration of how American manufacturing power rises and falls, how families build empires on the backs of workers they never see as equals, and how legacy gets rewritten by those who profit from forgetting, I'd appreciate your support through a like. It helps others find these stories that mainstream history often overlooks. And if you have thoughts on what institution or family I should examine next, leave a comment. I read them all. The story of Schwinn is not unique, it is representative, and there are hundreds more like it, waiting to be told.